Question for you black women. Can Toni Cade Bambara help black women's mindset upgrade? Hey sis, over the weekend I dipped back into one of my favourite books, Black Women Writers at Work, 1983 by Claudia Tate, an anthology of intimate talks and interviews with some of the heavyweight women writers of African descent from today and yesteryear. I say this as from the 14 black women featured, only a handful of them are alive as I write this. One interview stood out. It clearly highlighted how the pro-black black woman's role, as she has historically been conditioned to be, and in many ways still is today, is detrimental to her black daughter, and other black women. Just writing this or even speaking it out loud for this recording, it feels like something that I really shouldn't say. Like the biggest taboo for a black woman to say is, you know what, this pro-blackness, it's not really serving us. As at one point, I too fell under this spell. This is not to say I'm against being pro-black. Far from it, I'm not. However, I deeply looked at the requirements that the community has for black women to be pro-black. Then it became even clearer to me that there needs to be a change in what pro-black means to black women specifically in the 21st century in order to preserve her, empower her, and make sure this ideology works to her advantage than, better than it has done from what history shows us. But how? That was the next question. Well, after some thought, it could be argued that we can't really rely on the evolution of pro-blackness to come from black men because it's benefited them for centuries more than it has black females. In other words, why would they want any change? Therefore, it's down to black women. Toni Cade Bambara's interview showed me why there's a need for change and just how long this change has been needed. What's key for black women today? From this interview. Toni Cade Bambara was born Miltona Merkin Cade. Her interview took place the year I was born, in 1983, which was the same year that this anthology of interviews was published. Toni caught my eye a few years back when I read the Black Woman Anthology, 1970. She was a key player in gathering the various black women writers together and placing this collection of work into one volume. I'm pushed to revisit parts of her interview in Black Women Writers at Work, 1983, for many reasons, but mainly because of what struck me as I read her particular interview. It clearly highlights a mindset of black women of the time, which 40 plus years later, and after her death at the time of me writing this, is easy to see has not changed when we look at the community dynamics, data, research, the roles that we play, or even when we look on social media. If we consider some of her responses in her interview, this can help course correct for black women and lead to a better future, further empowerment for us as a group of women, and maybe even reverse some of the negative trends within the diaspora of people of African descent. This is not to say that black women are at fault, far from it. But what I am saying is these vintage interviews and documents we have access to shows us it's all about the conditioning we've had as women. And funnily enough, it's not been from our oppressors, but from our own men. That said, this is not a criticism of Toni or the black women who may have had that mindset back then, or maybe even still do have it now. It's purely about bringing to the forefront of as many black women's minds, how did we end up here and how the hell are we going to move forward? Given all that has happened for black women historically and presently in the current time of me writing this essay. If in need, call a black woman. Now, across social media, in the political climate that the USA has, for example, at the time of me writing this, it's very clear to see that black women are being called on left, right, and centre. But who is calling? Why are they calling? And should we be answering that call or just send it straight to voicemail? What comes to mind is the current climate for white women and white Hispanic women and their recent pleas to black women for solidarity and support after voting for Trump's policies that directly impact women as a whole, regardless of race, but possibly they thought their whiteness could save them from the impact. I've seen many video clips that seem to show they are experiencing some kind of buyer's remorse over their vote, which from this demographic of women went to Trump's oppressive policies in the majority, not the minority. Now, I covered their voting, the results, in a recent essay which can be found in the written version of this article. There's a link directly to it, or if you look somewhere down in the description box if you are listening to this on YouTube. Now, this covers details on how the voting for each demographic of men and women actually went. Then we have cases of black men who are murdered by their white girlfriends and their families pleas to black women in particular to support them to get justice, as they call it, only to find out in the same breath that the deceased black man made a whole career online out of disrespecting black women. Examples of these black men and their disrespect towards black women, which we can obviously look back on their social media and see that it dates back years, comes from people like Toby Obenselli in 2022 and the most recent Talvin Osborne in 2025. Now, personally, when I heard about these cases as a black woman, I said to myself, you know what? If these white women said it was self-defense and they were not guilty of murder, then yes, I guess they're right. And I moved straight on. And I hope every black woman around the diaspora has done this or will do the same when they learn about these cases. These are not men to be lending support to for any kind of advocacy. What we see here with cases like this is not an injustice, as their families have tried to call it, but a case of domestic disputes that ended in murder. And this is between, black men who hated black women and loved white women, and white women who decided to murder them for their own reasons. This is really none of any black woman's business. But back to Toni. Toni under the microscope. There are two questions after reading this interview 40 years later. Firstly, can a black woman truly be for women's rights, a feminist, if that's how she wants to identify, or even womanist, to use Alice Walker's term, and still be so focused on pro-blackness from a male point of view when it comes to advocacy? Secondly, can a black woman advocate for women from a place of fear to address the harm and wrongdoing that men do to women, children, the community, the diaspora of blacks, the planet, animals, everything around us, but exclude black men from this pool of said men out of fear of addressing their part that they play in the harm? Really think about this. The black feminist, her interview responses. So when asked by Claudia Tate, the interviewer, how does being black and female constitute a particular perspective in your work, Toni made her stance clear by saying black women having a unique outlook as writers and members of society. Very true. She then went on to say, as black and woman in a society systematically orchestrated to oppress each and both, we have a very particular vantage point and therefore have a special contribution to make to the collective intelligence, to the literatures of this historical moment. So this is from Black Women Writers at Work, 1983, page 31. She also added, I'm about the empowerment and development of our sisters and our community. But I have to question, was she? The reason I question this is not as a criticism, as I've already mentioned, but for reflection and to see where possibly a shift for black women is needed. Coming from a mindset of males first and absorbing all of their troubles in society without considering your own or other black women's in the diaspora as a whole, this restricts a woman from doing exactly what Toni stated we should do and what she herself set out to do during a very critical time for black people and their history. Time to be honest. Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman. So an example of how the male's first attitude and not considering the harm being done to women restricts any black woman from achieving her own empowerment, as Toni set out to do. Toni was very critical of Michelle Wallace's brilliant work that she penned called Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman, 1979, which I recommend all black women read and do so with a very open and non-male-centered mindset. In the written version of this article, you will find the link for this directly somewhere below. If you're listening to this on YouTube, you can read it for free, Michelle's work, in that link, or why not support her financially and buy a copy of the book from Amazon. As you read this, grab your highlighter, as you will need it. Many parts will stand out to you more than 40 years after its original publication. Toni's critique came when Michelle brilliantly laid out her take on the issues in the Black community. She did this with brutal honesty about Black women being seen as helpmates and doers for Black men, with little in return but disrespect, treason, and a lack of loyalty. Now, when we consider the likes of Black men such as Toby Obenselli in 2022 and the most recent Talvin Osborne in 2025, who both made media headlines for doing exactly what Michelle pointed out in 1979, then we consider how their families have or currently are still pleading with Black women for help and support. Ask yourself, what's really changed from Michelle's original observations other than the date and the time period? Michelle Wallace also challenges the white male sociologist, which you may have heard of, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, for his study done, The Negro Family, A Case for National Action, 1965. She does this while debunking the myth of the Black Superwoman archetype. Here's where the beauty of the future lies, because anyone who may have read Michelle's work back then may have had a critical view of Michelle and her work. And this relates to Toni also, because at this point in time, to be pro-Black for a Black woman meant, as I've kind of highlighted, putting Black men and their needs first, not saying a single critical or even honest thing about the community, where it was at, or the behaviour of men in the community towards women, which meant turning a blind eye to their disrespect, abandonment of children, and their love and praise and uplifting and preference, quote unquote, what they like to call it today, of non-Black women, in particular white women, over and above Black women. With no valid reason, mind you, they just do this. Also, it meant viewing women's rights, equality, or the fight for women to be treated better as the devil himself, which meant, for Black women, encouragement to not align with other women's causes, to advance the gender of women as a whole, regardless of race, and a sisterhood of women, not based on race, is what pro-Blackness in this context has always opposed, because that would mean Black women would need to take a very close look at the behaviours of their men, just like the other races of women look at the behaviour of their men and take a stance against it. This in particular would not benefit the men in our community, so of course it was discouraged. At this point, the generational conditioning of Black women is really uncovered in Toni's interview. As much as I love Toni and all the other 13 Black women writers of the 20th century interviewed for this particular book, Black Women Writers at Work 1983, this is, in retrospect, was the starting point of Black women's generational conditioning towards pro-Blackness. That does not benefit them at all as a Black person, let alone a woman. Looking back, I would argue Toni saw no value in Michelle's work because she too was under this conditioning. She too was under this pro-Blackness and what it meant. This mindset didn't serve our foremothers well at all. I would argue that Michelle Wallace's approach was right and could have better served Black women then in the time that her work was published, as well as now. When we look at where we are 40 plus years later, I believe without any doubt it will certainly serve us as a group of women now, no matter where you're from in the diaspora or where you're currently living today. Giving with one hand and taking away with the other. So there's a saying in the Carib Islands that my mum always used, and she always said that you can't give with one hand and take away with the other. This is in some ways what the historical pro-Blackness approach and mindset has done to and for Black women, especially when we look at what history and vintage interviews such as Toni's show us. We see Yester-years giving with one hand to the cause of Black women, their protection, their care, their rights to say no to certain things and generational conditioning. But on the other hand, we see overlooking the disrespect and other issues related to how the men conduct themselves towards women and us within the community. We see this manifest with the 2 Black men murdered by white women, already mentioned, and also in the anthology Toni published, featuring at the time a really lovely lineup of Black women writers of the mid-20th century. And this was the Black Woman Anthology 1970, which, if you're seeing this in the written version of this essay, there is a direct link and you can read it for free. Or of course, there's the option to go and look for it on Amazon. Now, in this particular anthology that I refer to, as I read through the work, Black women were at the time of its publication very conscious of the need to assert their needs, quote unquote, but they kept quiet about it and they said nothing. What we can observe as we look at cases like Toby Obenselli from 2022 and the most recent Talvin Osborne of 2025 is that over 40 years later, the don't critique the males in our community attitude does 2 things. 1, they, the Black males, don't thank us for it. Look at the disrespect of just these 2 cases that come to mind. We see this every day on social media. This is more like a norm rather than the exception from the men within our community. 2, this attitude that's slightly detrimental to us as women, it overrides the bravery of women like Michelle Wallace. She was brave enough to speak up and make her observation in the heat of things in a very politically and racially charged time for Black people. And who did she do it for? Women, Black women, and rightly so. This is my observation from a millennial Black woman's point of view, years after the publishing of Toni's interview, years after Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman, 1979, from Michelle Wallace, and years after Toni's own publication, The Black Woman Anthology from 1970. So Toni's 1969 essay, let's look at this. In Toni's essay, she penned for The Black Woman Anthology 1969, called The Issue of Roles. It clearly shows that 14 years prior to her interview that she did for the book Black Women Writers at Work in 1983, she too was conscious of the portrayal of women and how this needed to be addressed. However, by the time she got around to reading Michelle's work and doing her interview in 1983, and, seeing Michelle Wallace's efforts to do just that, change the portrayal of women, not just focusing on the damage that white men do, but also Black men, Toni was super critical, which I couldn't quite get. She went on to say in her interview, in response to Michelle Wallace's work, "Oh, I feel bad for her, who sees shortcomings in the Black movement and attempts to find a home in the feminist movement. There's a fine book there," meaning Michelle's work. "It just got buried under the one that we got." And this quotation from Toni is directly from Black Women Writers at Work, 1983, page 55. While my intention has never been and is still not to crucify Toni, I get that her views are very much in line with the context and women's mindset around pro-Blackness of the time. What I am trying to point out is that this mindset is dangerous to herself, this would be Toni, young Black girls, and other Black women, because it is doing what pro-Blackness wanted Black women to do, which we've already established is to ignore their needs and their own womanhood in favour of the advancement of the Black race purely via the advancement of men. These vintage works to see where the mindset of Black women has come from and its conditioning, along with reflection, have convinced me that Black women need a mental upgrade all over the diaspora, all over the African diaspora. We desperately need it. And we need this upgrade for what it means to be pro-Black. and allow this upgrade to be inclusive of them or us and Black women and our needs, or just call it Pro-Black Woman and centre from that place rather than being, centred on pro-Black and focusing on men. I do also maintain an observation I made before, that racism has provided, sadly, Black women with some kind of codependency with Black men and encouraged us to support and fight against racism, but from a other perspective, meaning a male perspective, not our own, perspective as women. The evidence of this is in the mindset, the views, and the continued separation of our own womanhood that Black women have in order to battle against racism that both sexes face, but from a different perspective. Now, for Black American women in this part of the diaspora, with all that's currently happening in the US with Trump and his re-election at the time of me writing this, and things like DEI rolling back and the general rolling back of women's rights in this part of the world, I do think that as Black women, we need to be mindful that this separation of our own experiences and womanhood as Black women don't lead us down a path that we should or could have avoided. Now, if we look back at the path that's been travelled so far when it comes to pro-Blackness and what it has meant for us as women, I say this because as the heat gets turned up with Trump's new world he wants to create, and he isolates Americans more and more from the rest of the world with his politics, the men in the community are going to be turning to you more. And by this, I mean American Black women. They are going to be turning to you more. And what are you going to do? For women outside of this part of the world, like myself, as we observe what's happening for the community of Black people in America, support is needed for Blacks in this part of the diaspora. Yes, totally, 100%. But it also is a time to revisit the same question. What does pro-Black mean to us as women in the age and times we're living in now? And it does need reshaping. It needs to be centered more on ourselves and us as women and our experiences. A woman to remember. No matter what Toni's viewpoint on Michelle Wallace and her work was, she is a woman to remember. The Black Woman Anthology 1970, which she put together, will always be one of my favourite books. It opened me to, it opened my eyes up to the conditions of Black women, especially from a Black American perspective. So I'm so glad that she placed it together. And in her 1983 essay for Black Women Writers at Work, what shone through was her personality. Boy, was it big. And it seemed fun. And in some ways, really, really relaxed. She confessed to having no routine when it comes to her writing. Compared to Maya Angelou, for example, shutting herself in a hotel room with just a desk, a pencil, paper, and an alcoholic drink, or even Toni Morrison's 5 a.m. wake up every day to write, Toni seemed like what Stephen King coined as a pantster. No planning, no routine, no plot, just write. Personally, I respect writers like this because if I had no plot, I'd have no cue for my imagination as a creative fiction writer. As an essayist with no idea over my structure for a non-fiction piece, I could never really argue my points well. So respect to Toni and respect to all pantsters. Much love, the Black Woman Essayist.